The Rivers Mansion, a grand estate that reflected years of business success, was quieter than ever. Its long, luxurious hallways, once filled with laughter and conversation, now echoed only the solitary footsteps of Alexander Rivers. The business magnate, known for his coldness and determination, was feeling the crushing weight of loneliness for the first time. Alexander had always been a man of action, someone who believed that hard work and discipline were the keys to success. It was this philosophy that led him to build a business empire, but it also distanced him from his family, especially from his son, Ethan. For Alexander, work always came first, and the long hours he spent in the office meant that he was rarely at home. Ethan, in turn, grew up in the shadow of his father's success but never felt part of it. The only constant in Ethan's life was his mother, Grace. She was the heart and soul of the family, always present to make up for her husband's absence. Grace and Ethan shared a deep bond, a connection that Alexander never fully understood. When Grace fell ill, Ethan's world began to crumble. He spent months by his mother's side, hoping for a miracle that never came. When she passed away, something inside Ethan broke. He felt that the only person who truly understood him was gone forever. The pain of loss transformed Ethan. The young man, who had already shown signs of rebellion, became completely unruly. Without his mother to guide him and with an emotionally distant father, Ethan sought to fill the void with parties, women, and extravagant purchases. He spent his father's money irresponsibly, buying luxury cars, organizing lavish events, and surrounding himself with people who were only interested in his wealth. Alexander watched Ethan's downward spiral with a mixture of frustration and sadness. He had lost his wife, and now he felt that he was losing his son to a world of superficiality and excess. But for Alexander, things reached a breaking point when Ethan made a mistake that surpassed all others. One night, like any other, Ethan organized a party in his penthouse in the city center. The event, as usual, was luxurious and full of guests he barely knew. As the night progressed, fueled by alcohol and displays of power, Ethan became embroiled in a heated argument with one of the guests. What began as a trivial disagreement quickly escalated into a physical fight, and in the heat of the moment, Ethan, in his fury, destroyed a priceless piece of art belonging to an influential neighbor. The incident could have had serious legal consequences, but Alexander, with his influence and resources, managed to suppress the scandal before it became public. However, the damage was already done. When Ethan returned home that night, still disoriented by anger and alcohol, he was confronted by a father he had never seen so disappointed. "You've crossed the line, Ethan," Alexander said, his voice cold and controlled but with an intensity that Ethan had never felt before. "It's not just the money you've wasted or the reputation you've tarnished. It's the fact that you continue to disrespect everything our family has built, everything your mother always valued." Ethan tried to defend himself, but the words tangled in his mouth. He had never seen his father like this. Despite their differences, he never imagined he could see such disappointment in his father's eyes. "I tried to give you everything, hoping you would find your way," Alexander continued. "But it's clear that I've failed. Not just as a father, but as a role model for you. And that's why things are going to change." The next day, Alexander made a decision that would change Ethan's life forever. He bought a small rural property in a distant state, far from all the distractions and temptations of the big city. When he confronted Ethan once more, Alexander explained what he had decided. "You're going to move to this property," Alexander said, handing him an envelope with the deed and the keys. "You will live there without the help of my money. Your credit cards are blocked. If you want to return home, you will have to prove to me that you are capable of being a real man. That you can live on your own, learn the value of hard work, and understand what it means to build something for yourself." Ethan was in shock. The idea of being exiled to a life he had never known, far from everything familiar, seemed impossible. "You can't do this to me," he protested, his voice full of disbelief and anger. "This isn't fair." "Fair?" Alexander responded with a frightening calm. "Life has never been fair, Ethan. But this is the only way I see to save you from yourself. I don't want you to end up destroying your own life as you have been doing." If you want the right to return to this house, you will have to earn that right." With no options and no strength to fight against his father's determination, Ethan accepted the bitter reality. Within days, he found himself in a car driven by one of his father's employees, on his way to a small town in a state he barely knew. As the big city faded behind him, Ethan felt a mixture of fear and despair. He had never been so alone, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the consequences of his actions. When the car stopped in front of the small rural property, Ethan stepped out slowly, looking around. The place was everything he feared: isolated, simple, far from the luxury and sophistication he was used to. The house was a modest structure with weathered wood and a garden that showed signs of neglect. It was a stark contrast to the mansion he had grown up in. The driver handed him the keys to the house and a suitcase with some clothes. "This is all you have now," he said before bidding farewell. "Good luck, Ethan." Ethan stood there alone, holding the keys in one hand and the suitcase in the other. The silence around him was oppressive, and he realized that this would be his life now. No parties, no friends, no comfort from his father's fortune. Just him, the simple house, and the emptiness of the countryside. With no other choice, Ethan entered the house. The interior was as simple as the exterior: a small living room with a fireplace, a modest kitchen, and a bedroom with an iron bed and an old wardrobe. He dropped the suitcase on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, feeling the weight of the situation fall on him like an avalanche. For the first time in his life, he was on his own, and the feeling was terrifyingly real. And so began Ethan's new life, marked by solitude, hard work, and the need to survive in a world he had never known. But what he didn't know as he stared at the ceiling of the small house that first night was that this new life was about to transform him in ways he could never have imagined. The first days of Ethan's life on the small rural property were a brutal shock for him. Accustomed to the luxury and ease that his father's fortune had always provided, he now found himself confronted with the harsh reality of simple life. The house he now inhabited was humble, with old and worn-out furniture and a sense of abandonment that reflected the state of his own life. On the first morning, Ethan woke up with the sunlight streaming through the curtainless windows. The silence was almost deafening, a complete absence of the constant noises of the city he knew so well. He got up, feeling the cold wooden floor under his bare feet, and went to the kitchen. Opening the cupboards, he realized there wasn't much to eat: some canned goods and basic food items his father had provided before his arrival. Without any cooking skills, he improvised a meal with bread and coffee, feeling a deepening discouragement with each bite. After eating, Ethan began to explore the house. The main room had a fireplace that didn't seem to have been used in years, and the walls were decorated with dusty pictures of rural landscapes. The bedroom was small, with an iron bed that creaked with every movement. He opened the windows in hopes of airing out the place, but all he achieved was letting in the strong smell of the countryside: earth, grass, and something he couldn't identify but seemed to be ingrained in everything around. The reality of his situation became clearer with each passing minute. He had no one to turn to, no employees to do the chores, and no delivery service to bring the comforts of urban life. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized that he was completely alone. In the days that followed, Ethan struggled to adapt to his new routine. Cooking, doing laundry, and keeping the house in order were tasks he had never done before. He burned his first attempts at cooking a decent meal, stained several clothes while trying to wash them in the house's old washing machine, and struggled to light the fireplace on cold nights. Every little task seemed like a mountain to climb, and frustration was constant. He wondered if his father knew how much he was suffering, and more than once, he thought about giving up, taking the car, and fleeing back to the city. But then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while trying in vain to fix a faucet that dripped incessantly, Ethan heard a soft knock on the door. Surprised, he went to answer, not expecting to find anyone in that remote place. When he opened the door, he found an elderly couple smiling warmly at him. "Hello, neighbor," said the man, an old man with white hair and a welcoming smile. "We're Tom and Margaret. We live on the neighboring property and heard someone had moved in here. We came to welcome you." Ethan, disconcerted by the unexpected kindness, took a moment to react. "Oh, sure. Thank you. Please come in," he said, unsure of how to handle the situation. Tom and Margaret entered the small house, and Ethan, trying to be polite, invited them to sit in the living room. Margaret, a calm and affectionate-looking lady, handed him a freshly baked pie, still warm. "It's just a welcome gift," she said, smiling. "We thought you might like it." Ethan thanked them, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He wasn't used to this kind of interaction and didn't know how to reciprocate their kindness. "Would you like to have dinner with me? I couldn't possibly eat all this by myself," he offered more out of politeness than conviction. The couple accepted the invitation, and soon the three were gathered at the small kitchen table. Ethan, still a little uneasy, heated up some canned soup and served the pie for dessert. Despite the simplicity of the meal, the conversation was pleasant. Tom and Margaret, curious about how a young man had ended up in such a remote place, began to ask questions. Ethan, uncomfortable revealing the truth about his situation, twisted the story a bit. "My family is very wealthy," he explained, trying to keep a casual tone. "But after my mother passed away, I felt I needed a change. I wanted to experience a simpler life, away from the city." Tom nodded, admiring the young man's supposed choice. "It takes a lot of courage to make such a change. We've lived here for decades, and I can tell you it's a difficult but very rewarding life." Margaret agreed, offering a warm smile. "And if you need anything at all, we're just next door. Sometimes it's good to have company, especially when you're used to such a different life." That night marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Ethan, who had always felt disconnected from the people around him, found in Tom and Margaret a kindness and understanding he hadn't expected. They didn't judge him for his past or his family's wealth but accepted him for who he was, a young man trying to find his place in the world. In the days that followed, Tom began to show up at Ethan's property to help with tasks he didn't know how to do. He taught Ethan how to fix the faucet, chop wood, and make simple repairs around the house. Ethan, initially reluctant, began to appreciate the time he spent with Tom. He discovered that there was something gratifying about using his own hands to solve problems, about learning skills he never imagined he would need. Margaret also helped him, teaching him how to cook simple but tasty meals and how to take care of the house efficiently. Little by little, Ethan began to feel more capable, more confident in his new life. The property that once seemed like a prison began to transform into a place where he could find some meaning. Ethan still missed the city, his friends, and the easy life he once led, but something was changing within him. He began to realize that despite all the difficulties, there was something valuable in that simple life. He was becoming more independent, more resilient, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was building something for himself. The summer advanced quickly, and with it, Ethan's life on the small rural property continued to transform. The young man who initially saw the countryside as a forced exile was now beginning to find satisfaction in activities he had never imagined doing before. His friendship with Tom and Margaret flourished, and the elderly couple became an essential part of his new life. Tom, with his patience and experience, spent hours teaching Ethan how to do basic maintenance around the house. Together, they repaired the old fence that surrounded the property, replacing rotten boards and reinforcing the posts. Tom also taught Ethan the importance of keeping tools in good condition, showing him how to sharpen them and store them properly. Each completed task was a small triumph for Ethan, who began to feel a growing pride in his ability to take care of himself. The activity Ethan dreaded most, however, was chopping wood. The first time Tom handed him an axe, Ethan held the tool with some hesitation. But Tom, with his encouraging manner, patiently taught him how to hold the axe, the correct foot position, and how to apply force at the right moment. Ethan's first attempts were clumsy and frustrating, but over time he began to get the hang of it. The physical effort that initially exhausted him began to transform into a way to clear his mind and body. With each strike, he felt not only the wood splitting but also his own resistance to that new life breaking apart. While Tom helped Ethan with the heavier and more technical tasks, Margaret guided him in his culinary and domestic education. She taught him how to make simple but nutritious dishes, and soon Ethan was cooking his own meals with a skill he never thought he would possess. He learned to bake homemade bread, cook stews, and even prepare simple desserts for the weekends. Margaret also taught him how to keep the house in order, cleaning and organizing efficiently. She explained that a well-kept house reflected the mind and heart of its inhabitant. The days began to have an almost pleasurable routine. Ethan would wake up early, do his morning chores, work on the house or land, and in the afternoon, spend a few hours with Tom and Margaret. Every day, he felt his initial resistance dissolving, giving way to an acceptance and even a certain fondness for the new life he was building. One of the most significant moments of this transformation occurred when Tom suggested they fix the old truck that had been abandoned in the barn. The vehicle, a rusty piece of metal covered in dust, seemed like an impossible project. But Tom, with his characteristic smile, assured Ethan that with patience and hard work, they could bring it back to life. At first, Ethan doubted they could do it. The engine was damaged, the tires flat, and the paint almost non-existent. But Tom had a clear vision and, with his mechanical knowledge, began to guide Ethan through the restoration process. They disassembled the engine piece by piece, cleaning and replacing the worn parts. Ethan, who had never held a wrench before arriving there, found himself immersed in the work, getting his hands dirty with grease and experiencing a satisfaction that was completely new to him. As the work progressed, Ethan began to feel more confident in his abilities. He started to understand how each part of the engine worked, how everything fit together to make the truck run. The work was exhausting, but at the end of each day, when he looked at the progress they had made, he felt a sense of accomplishment he had never felt before. Finally, after weeks of hard work, the day came to test the truck. Ethan was nervous, but Tom was confident. They filled the tank, checked all the systems, and with a final silent prayer, Ethan turned the ignition key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then, with a deep roar, came to life. The sound of the engine running was like music to Ethan's ears. He looked at Tom, who patted him on the back, smiling from ear to ear. "I told you we'd do it, son," Tom said with a warm laugh. Ethan couldn't hold back his smile. The feeling of having restored the truck with his own hands was indescribable. He drove the vehicle around the property, feeling the wind on his face and the freedom that the old truck represented. It was more than a repaired car, it was a symbol of his own transformation. With the truck now running, Ethan decided to look for a job in the nearby town. He knew he still needed to learn to manage his own life financially, and working would be an important step in that direction. He found a modest job at a mechanic's shop, where his newly acquired knowledge proved valuable. The work was simple but challenging, and Ethan began to earn his own money for the first time in his life. The months passed quickly, and with them, Ethan became a completely different person. The rebellious and lost young man who had arrived at that property had been replaced by a hard-working, humble man proud of his independence. He continued to spend time with Tom and Margaret, now not just as a neighbor but as a true member of the family. Autumn arrived in the small town, bringing with it a chilly breeze and the beginning of the transformation of the leaves. The vibrant colors of the trees were a contrast to the somber mood that hung over Tom and Margaret's property. The couple, who had always been the epitome of vigor and joy, were now facing a challenge that no one could have predicted. Tom, who had always been active and full of life, began to complain of constant fatigue. Initially, he attributed it to his age, but when the fatigue turned into pain that prevented him from performing even the simplest tasks, it became clear that something was wrong. Margaret insisted he see a doctor, and the news they received was devastating. Tom was gravely ill, and the situation was much more serious than they had imagined. Ethan, who had become an essential part of the couple's life, was deeply shaken by the news. He had grown attached to Tom as to a grandfather, and seeing him fall so quickly was like losing a father figure all over again. Ethan began to help even more around the property, taking on the responsibilities that had once been Tom's. He dedicated himself fully, taking care not only of his own house but also of that of his neighbors, who now felt like his own family. As Tom's condition worsened, Tom and Margaret's children, who lived in other cities, came to offer assistance. Among them was Sarah, the couple's youngest daughter, a young woman of about 28 who had the same kindness and inner strength as Margaret. Sarah, who worked as a nurse in a distant city, had left everything behind to be with her parents during this difficult time. When Sarah arrived at the property, she and Ethan met for the first time. Despite the grim circumstances, there was an immediate connection between them. Sarah, with her warm and gentle nature, brought a quiet relief to the pain everyone was feeling. She quickly took the lead in Tom's medical care, administering medication and ensuring he was as comfortable as possible. Ethan, in turn, volunteered to take on the heavier tasks and keep the properties running, allowing Sarah and Margaret to focus on Tom. As the days passed, Tom's situation worsened. The house, which had always been full of life, was now enveloped in a sadness that was palpable. Margaret, who had always been a pillar of strength, began to crumble in the face of the prospect of losing her husband. Ethan became her emotional support, helping her keep the house in order and offering a shoulder to lean on in the moments of greatest need. Sarah, seeing how much Ethan had become a part of her parents' lives, felt a deep gratitude toward him. They spent many nights talking after everyone else had gone to bed, sharing stories and finding comfort in each other. Ethan felt something growing between them, a feeling of companionship and respect that went beyond simple friendship. However, both knew that this was not the time to explore these feelings. The priority was to care for Tom. Unfortunately, the worst happened. After weeks of struggle, Tom succumbed to his illness and passed away on a cold autumn morning. His death was a devastating blow to everyone, especially to Margaret, who now faced the harsh reality of continuing life without her partner of decades. The funeral was simple but touching. The local community turned out in force to pay their last respects to Tom, who had been a pillar in the lives of many there. Ethan stood firm beside Margaret and Sarah, offering as much support as he could. He helped organize everything, from the wake to the burial, ensuring that Tom was remembered with the respect and dignity he deserved. After the funeral, Margaret's house felt emptier than ever. Sarah, though she wanted to stay, had to return to her job in the city but promised to visit frequently. Before leaving, she and Ethan had one last conversation on the porch of the house. "I don't know how we're going to manage without him," Sarah said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I know you've done more for my mother and father than any of us could have." "I'll never forget that, Ethan." Ethan, who was also struggling with his own emotions, responded sincerely. "I owe them a lot, Sarah. And to you too. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed, a home, a family. I won't leave your mother alone. I'll stay here and take care of her." Sarah smiled, though her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Ethan. Knowing you'll be here for her gives me some peace." They said goodbye with a hug, a gesture that sealed not just a promise but also the beginning of something deeper that both felt but could not express at that moment. With Sarah's departure, the responsibility of caring for Margaret fell entirely on Ethan. He dedicated himself even more, taking all the necessary steps to ensure she was comfortable and that the house was kept in order. The pain of losing Tom was deep, but gradually, Margaret found comfort in Ethan's constant presence. The months passed slowly, and winter arrived, bringing with it the cold and snow that covered the small property. Ethan and Margaret adapted to the new routine, finding strength in each other to carry on. Ethan knew his life had changed forever, and that the small property he had initially despised had become the center of everything he now valued. Spring arrived, bringing with it a renewal to the small rural property. The flowers were blooming, the birds were singing, and the air was filled with a freshness that only that season could bring. It was a time of renewal, and for Ethan, also a time of reflection. A year had passed since he was sent to that remote place, and much had changed in his life. That day, Ethan was on Margaret's property, carrying out the daily tasks. Since Tom's death, he had fully taken over the care of the house and land, ensuring that Margaret lacked nothing. Ethan's presence had been a balm for Margaret's grief, and together they found a new routine that partly filled the void left by Tom. Ethan was chopping wood beside the barn when he heard the sound of a car approaching. He paused for a moment, puzzled, as they rarely received unexpected visitors. With the axe still in hand, he walked to the front of the house, and to his surprise, saw a luxury car pulling into the driveway. Out stepped Alexander, his father. Ethan's heart raced. He hadn't seen his father since the day he was sent to the property, and he had often wondered what the reunion would be like. But nothing prepared him for the sight he had at that moment. His father, the man always so firm and controlled, now seemed vulnerable, almost anxious. Alexander, in turn, was stunned to see his son. The young man he had sent to the countryside had disappeared. In his place stood a man of robust appearance, with simple, work-worn clothes, a face bronzed by the sun, and hands calloused by effort. The transformation was so profound that for a moment, Alexander barely recognized his own son. Ethan dropped the axe and walked toward his father, his heart heavy with the tension of the moment. When he stopped in front of him, there was a moment of silence where they both studied each other, trying to understand what had changed since the last time they saw each other. "Father," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but filled with emotion. "Ethan," Alexander replied, a lump in his throat. I came to see how you're doing." What happened next was unexpected for both of them. Without saying anything more, Ethan took a step forward and hugged his father. It was a strong, sincere hug, full of unspoken emotions. Alexander, surprised, returned the gesture, and the two remained like that for a moment, allowing the weight of everything unsaid over the past year to dissipate. "You've changed, son," Alexander said when they parted, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes, father. A lot has changed," Ethan replied, feeling the sincerity in his own voice. Alexander looked around, admiring the well-kept property, the woods stacked beside the barn, the blooming garden that Margaret and Ethan had planted together. Everything there reflected the hard work and care of someone who had found purpose in a simple but meaningful life. "I thought you wouldn't last here, Ethan," Alexander confessed, still surprised by what he saw. "When I sent you here, I feared you would hate me forever." Ethan sighed, shaking his head. "I did hate it, father. At first, I hated all of this. But, over time, I began to understand. I needed this. I needed to find something that was just mine, away from everything else." Alexander looked at his son, feeling a mixture of pride and regret. "And did you find it?" "Yes," Ethan said with a soft smile. "I found it. I found a new life here, a new family. And now I can't just abandon that." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding. "I understand, son. You've done what I never managed to do, found a balance, something real." They continued talking as they walked toward the house. Margaret, who had been watching the scene from the window, came out to greet Alexander. She received him with a warm smile, and he greeted her with respect, understanding how much she meant to Ethan. Inside the house, the three sat in the small living room, where Margaret served tea and cookies she had prepared that morning. Ethan and Alexander shared stories, and for the first time in a long time, they talked as father and son, without the barriers of pride and distance that had always existed between them. Finally, Alexander spoke up. "Ethan, I came here today to tell you that the test is over. You've proven more than I expected, and I'm very proud of who you've become. If you want, you can come back home. Everything that is mine is also yours." Ethan looked at his father with gratitude, but his decision was already made. "Father, thank you. But this is my home now. Margaret needs me, and I've found something here that I never had before, the feeling that I'm building something with my own hands." Alexander was silent for a moment, absorbing his son's words. Then, with a sad smile, he nodded. "I understand, Ethan. And I respect your decision." He took a credit card from his wallet and handed it to Ethan. "I want you to use this not to return to that life, but to improve what you've built here. Do whatever it takes to give you and Margaret a comfortable life." Ethan accepted the card, feeling the emotion stir within him. "Thank you, Father. This means a lot to me. And I'd love for you to visit more often." Alexander smiled, this time with genuine joy. "Nothing would make me happier, Ethan." The rest of the day passed peacefully and pleasantly. Alexander spent more time with Ethan and Margaret, learning more about the life his son had built. When it was time to leave, father and son said goodbye with a sense of peace and understanding that they had never experienced before. As Alexander drove back to the city, he reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that by sending Ethan to that small rural property, he had given his son the greatest opportunity of his life, to discover who he really was and what really mattered. And the man that Ethan had become was someone Alexander was immensely proud of. Back at the property, Ethan watched his father's car disappear down the road. Beside him, Margaret took his hand, smiling. "He's very proud of you, Ethan. And so am I." Ethan squeezed her hand in response. "I just want to keep doing what's right, Margaret. And having you here, and now my father more present, makes me feel like I'm on the right path." Years passed, and the small rural property that was once seen as a punishment flourished into a prosperous farm. Ethan, now more mature and serene, built a life full of meaning and love. He married Sarah, Tom and Margaret's daughter, and together they raised a son, a boy full of energy who brought joy to the house. On that day, Alexander, Ethan's father, made one of his frequent visits. He got out of the car and paused for a moment, observing the scene before him with a heart full of pride. Ethan was in the yard playing with his son, while Sarah and Margaret watched them closely, laughing and chatting. Alexander slowly approached, the sound of his arrival making Ethan look up and smile at his father. The boy ran to his grandfather, hugging his legs with the innocent joy of a child who knows only love. As Alexander knelt to pick up his grandson, he looked at Ethan, who was now a transformed man. A man who had found his path, his family, and his peace. "You've done a great job here, Ethan," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting the tranquility he had found in the simple life he had built. "I just followed what you taught me, Father. The importance of building something real." The two hugged, and in that moment, Alexander knew that the journey that had begun with a difficult decision had led to a destination he could never have imagined, a destination where true wealth was measured by love and the deep roots that united his family. As the sun began to set over the farm, Alexander stood there, holding his grandson, surrounded by those he loved most, knowing that his son had finally found his way home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.